Okay, so we are back, my friends, and we are going to begin talking about some other classics of the 17th century. Last segment, we're talking about John Donne at considerable length, and we're talking about the kinds of very complex shifts that take place not only in his personal history, but also in his poetry. And these are reflected very, very much in the kind of shift that we see going from some of his poetry, which is very light and deals with witty reflections on women and sexuality and so forth, and are basically entertainments. Basically just entertainments. I don't mean that there's anything wrong with that, but they certainly don't have the kind of profundity that we find in his holy sonnets later on. And then we also see, as in A Valediction Forbidding Mourning, another John Donne who now is a married man and who is very, very much in love with his wife and is celebrating his loving relationship with his wife. And of course then as we get to the Holy Sonnets, we have, as I mentioned in our last segment, some of the most beautiful and profound religious poetry in the English language. And this is something which has had enormous influence on all kinds of religious thinkers of various denominations, by the way. So, we now turn to another work, which of course has a very, very profound influence on the development of religious culture in England and throughout the English-speaking world, and that we will find in our anthology with the translations of the Bible into English. The greatest of which, of course, in terms of its influence certainly, has been what we usually call the King James Bible, though its official title is really the Authorized Version of the Bible of 1611. And it happens that King James, who was the titular head of the Church of England by virtue of being king, was the reigning monarch at the time that the scholars assigned this project, completed it. And so they presented the Bible with a dedicatory letter at the beginning of it to King James. And then this became, of course, what was called the Authorized Version of the Bible. For English-speaking Protestants, though in the meantime there had also been another translation of the Bible which had been produced in France on the continent by émigrés from England who were Catholic, and this was their response to the Protestant translations of the Bible. Now, what was at stake here? Let's talk first of all about the problems of translation. We aren't dealing here with works in another language. The closest we've come to it really is in Chaucer. And notice in Chaucer, there are all kinds of questions that come up about what do things mean? What do words mean? What do certain kinds of phrasing mean? And so forth, because Middle English is different enough from our modern English that it can cause us difficulties in interpretation at times, right? Well, think of how much more this is true when you're studying what to you is a foreign language. How many people here have studied another language? Okay, so most of the people here have studied another language. So you know the kind of thing that I'm talking about, where you will be, let's say, reading something in Spanish or French or Russian or whatever language it happens to be, and you're trying to explain that to somebody else. Perhaps your teacher or perhaps another student or simply a friend, and you say, well, what this says is sort of like such and such, but it's not exactly that because it's kind of sort of like this too. You know, and it's very difficult to get down the nuances and the connotations of certain terms as you go from one language to another. That is not a seamless process. It's something which is always fraught with all kinds of difficulties in interpretation, because a translation is not simply moving from one language to another with no alteration of style or content. A translation always involves certain kinds of compromises and alterations from the original, if nothing else, in emphasis or the nuances of certain terms. And we'll talk about some of these in terms of biblical translation in just a few moments. But let me just raise the question of the term love. Well, it just happens that in Latin, and one of our versions of the Bible here, the Douay version, was directly translated from the Latin Vulgate, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. The Latin language has several words, different words for love. I mean, we have our word love, right? And we get into all kinds of ambiguities with the use of the term love, because it's a term that covers such a wide range of different experiences. Whereas in the Latin language, there are very specific terms for different kinds of love. For example, the love between parents and children is expressed by one term. The term for the love which exists between lovers is a different term. The term which is used in connection with friendship, I mean, we love our friends, our close friends anyway, right? And that's yet another word in the Latin language. The term which is used in religious discourse for the relationship between God and humans, love, is expressed by yet another term or set of terms. So in the case of Latin, we're dealing with a language which already sets certain kinds of boundaries on what is intended and what people understand within the language community of Latin speakers. I mean, we don't have language communities of Latin speakers around nowadays, except perhaps in very small little study groups. But, you know, certainly in the ancient world, and in the medieval world, and in the Renaissance world, and in the 18th century, there were communities of people who had been educated sufficiently in Latin that they could be conversant with Latin. So, the only point I'm getting at here is the fairly obvious one that when you move from one language to another, you're always going to be running into certain kinds of questions and problems that you can't simply transfer all of the feelings and ideas and the experiences associated with certain words from one language into another language. So what do you do? Well, once again, as I've said before, you do the best you can, and this always involves certain kinds of compromises. If you were to read Seamus Heaney's now famous translation of Beowulf from Old English into Modern English, as I have had graduate students do. In fact, this last semester, I was teaching a graduate course in Beowulf in which the students were reading Beowulf in the original. Now, don't be alarmed. I mean, they'd already gone through a whole semester of training in the reading of Old English, and particularly of Old English poetry, before they got to the study of Beowulf. But nevertheless, when they were looking at the original, I would say, okay, I want you to read that side by side with Seamus Heaney's translation and with yet another translation, Talbot Donaldson's. And I want you to consider not simply what's going on in the original, but I want you to consider what's going on in these translations and the kinds of choices that people are making in these translations. And it was amazing. You know, when you look at Heaney's, for example, Heaney himself said, and he's said this in interviews, and he's also said this in published writing, that he thinks that he got it about 60% of the time. But you look at his translation, and an awful lot of Beowulf is really Seamus Heaney. For those of you who don't know Seamus Heaney, by the way, he is arguably the best known poet in the English language alive today. He's an Irishman, but you know, his poetry, of course, is, as you know, in English, and you know, somebody of immense worldwide reputation. So when somebody of that stature approaches one of our classic poems, such as Beowulf, obviously an enormous amount of attention is going to be paid to his version of Beowulf. But once again, it is a version of Beowulf. You're not just getting Beowulf directly. And the same thing is true with any translation. Now, those difficulties are reduced when you're looking at scientific and technical materials. You know, for example, when I was a graduate student and I had to pass special examinations in at least 2 foreign languages, one of the ones that I was examined in was German, and you could choose among different forms of the examination. You could choose the arts and the humanities, you could choose the social sciences, or you could choose the natural sciences. And despite the fact that I was a literature student, I chose the natural sciences. Guess why? Because the vocabulary is basically the same in German as it is in English. The terms in chemistry, the terms in physics, the terms in you know, electromagnetic fields and so forth are basically the same in German as they are in English. So it was actually much easier to translate, first of all, just to comprehend what was being said, and then secondly, to translate than, let's say, if you were dealing with poetry in German, or theology in German, or philosophy in German. So the difficulties that I'm talking about may be reduced somewhat if you're talking about a highly technical use of language, where it is in our interest to try to define as narrowly as possible the semantic range of certain terms, right? For example, in medicine, one of the things you do if you were to become a medical student is you have to learn the language, the highly specialized language of medical science. And you would have to learn how to use those terms with very great exactitude. Why? Because you're talking in many cases about life and death matters, and you've got to be able to communicate in a very precise way, without vagueness and without ambiguity, so that whomever you are communicating to will understand exactly what you're talking about, and will therefore be able to apply medical knowledge, which would be the same kind of medical knowledge that you would have in, let's say, the treatment of a patient. But obviously, in a case like poetry, we're dealing with an entirely different kind of language, aren't we? A world of discourse, a world of language in which we deliberately exploit the many semantic ranges and possibilities of words and phrasings and so forth. Look at Donne, look at Shakespeare, whom we've just been looking at in some detail. And look at how they'll constantly be playing with different nuances of words and punning, employing, you know, 2, sometimes 3 different senses of a particular word at the same time. At the same time. The same kinds of things obviously come up when one is attempting to interpret sacred texts such as the Bible, and this is true in other sacred traditions as well. So that I am by no means an expert on Hinduism or on Buddhism, but I understand from people who are experts that the sacred texts for those religious communities are open to constant interpretation and reinterpretation because of the nature of religious language itself. Apparently the same kind of thing, I understand, once again, not really knowing the subject myself, but I understand from others. The same thing is true in Islam, that there are many, many, many commentaries on the Quran, and there are different schools of thought for interpreting certain passages or terms in different ways. And that certainly is true in the traditions that I'm much more familiar with Judaism, but particularly with Christianity and the history of Christianity. So what happens? What happens? Well, if we look backwards from more modern times toward the more ancient times, we find that constantly religious denominations were splitting over the interpretation of a particular word or a particular line in the scripture. And people would get very, very worked up about different interpretations. Well, based on what? Based on what? Based typically on a particular version of the Bible with which they were beginning. So let's just talk a little bit about that. In very ancient times, the rabbis debated for a couple of centuries at least over not only what narratives and other kinds of generic forms would be included within the Hebrew Bible, but also what was going to be authoritative, what was going to be canonical, to go back to the term that we started using at the very beginning of the course. But eventually, they were able to settle on what came to be, according to rabbinical tradition, the canon of the Hebrew Bible. Now, there have been some debates about that, but those debates have been restricted not to rabbinical scholars alone, but also to Christian scholars, as we'll talk about a little bit later on. There are Protestant scholars who did not accept as canonical certain books from the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians call the Old Testament, whereas Catholic scholars did accept them. So if you were to pick up a Protestant authorized version of the Bible and compare it with a Catholic authorized version of the Bible, I'm talking about both of these in English, you would find that in the Protestant version, there were certain books of the Bible that were called Apocrypha, which are not so designated in the Catholic version, where they are accepted as authentic and reliable texts. Okay, so there have been debates about those kinds of things. There have been debates about some of the Christian or New Testament sections at different times among Christian scholars. But let's go back to the beginnings. We know that certainly in the early Christian communities, the earliest language spoken by the earliest Christians certainly would have been Aramaic, but they also, those who were involved in any kind of public affairs or business and so forth, would have at least known some Greek, because they were living in a part of the world which was dominated by Greek culture. And the language of commerce in the eastern end of the Mediterranean particularly was a kind of dialect of popular or slangy Greek, what is usually referred to as Koine, which is a kind of street language. It's sort of the kind of thing that we would think of as, first of all, there being a distinction between formal English, formal uses of the English language, and then the sorts of English that you would hear just people speaking, in the mall or on the streets or, among friends, where the language becomes very informal and even kind of slangy, right? Well, that's what happened to Greek too. And in the earliest communities, Christian communities, as Christianity began to spread first in the Greek-speaking world and then more and more in the direction of the Italian peninsula, what happened was that the earliest Gospels were either composed in Greek or were very quickly translated into Greek. The liturgy was in Greek. The hymns people sang were in Greek. The prayers they recited were in Greek. And Greek was the language of early Christianity in the earliest centuries. But as more and more people in the western parts of the Roman Empire began to convert to Christianity, their primary language was Latin. And they might know a little bit of Greek, but would be much, much more comfortable in Latin than they would be in Greek. Whereas in the eastern end of the Mediterranean, people tended to be more polylingual, so that the same person who spoke Aramaic, let's say, in the area where Jesus and his original colleagues were circulating, they would know that. They would also know some Hebrew, because they certainly would have heard Hebrew and had the Hebrew Bible recited. If they weren't able to read it themselves, they certainly would have heard recitations of it, though even that was going to be translated into Greek very early on. And if they had any kind of business, it's entirely likely that somebody like Jesus, whose earthly father at any rate, I don't want to get into theological disputes here, Joseph was a carpenter, and therefore he'd be a businessman, right? And he'd be doing jobs, and people would contract for him to do jobs for them, you know, to build things or to repair their houses or whatever. And so he would be, as a business person, probably at least fairly conversant with Greek of the kind that I'm talking about. But of course, the area is also dominated by the Romans, because it's now part of the Roman Empire, whose official language is Latin. And so, you know, interesting questions come up in the Christian or New Testament. What language was Jesus speaking when he's talking to Roman officers? What language is Jesus speaking when he's talking to Pontius Pilate, the governor, the Roman governor in Jerusalem? It's a very interesting kind of question, because notice the way this is represented in the gospel stories, at any rate. They're speaking without any translators. They're just speaking directly with one another. Well, what languages were they using then? At least according to one of the gospel accounts, when Jesus was crucified, they tack up over him what was supposed to have been the charge, the principal charge for which he was being executed. And that is in not one, not two, but three languages, right? The local language of the people, Greek and Latin. So we're talking about a community that was multi- or polylingual. And that was a heritage that continued in early Christianity for quite a long time. But as Christianity moved more and more in a westerly direction, there were fewer and fewer people who were conversant in Greek. Some, of course, would be, but fewer and fewer people. But people who could function in Latin. And so by around the 3rd century, there began to emerge what are called Old Latin, capital O and capital L, Old Latin translations or versions of the Bible. Well, those were apparently fairly crude. Scholars are still arguing about what those texts were, even where the texts might be found, how reliable the texts that have survived are as indications of the Old Latin Bible. But by the 4th century, the end of the 4th century and the beginning of the 5th century, the Pope, who was the head of the Western Christian Church in Rome, designated a certain scholar named Jerome to produce a translation of the Bible that would be really faithful to the original texts, to the extent to which the original texts were known. Now, Jerome was a very, very scholarly guy who had a real gift for languages and who also had a very, very good education in the religious traditions of early Christianity. And so he produced his translation of the Christian or New Testament, and then he began working on his translation of what Christians call the Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible. But he was translating from Greek, not directly from Hebrew, but from Greek into Latin. And then after a while, he began to realize that that raised all kinds of problems, because by this time he had moved to the Middle East, and he would find himself going down the street to consult the local rabbis and find out, he'd say, well, okay, I'm trying to translate this word out of Greek into Latin, but, you know, what does that word mean to you? You know, because obviously the Greek word was itself a translation of some Hebrew word. And so he started working with the rabbis, and they taught him Hebrew. And, you know, once again, this is a guy who's very gifted with languages, you know, the way some people are, who can just pick up languages very easily. Many of us have a lot of difficulty picking up languages, and it's, you know, it's a real struggle, you know, say, studying a language or moving into a community where, you know, you're the only one speaking the other, you know, not speaking the other language. But some people just very easily move from one language into another, and so on and so on. Especially if they've been exposed to other languages when they're small children. I mean, that's really one of the great keys. You know, I am a firm believer, if I can get on my soapbox just for a second, I am a firm believer in every child learning at least one other language as a small child. At least one other language. And it would be preferable to learn more than one other language. So, so anyway, having said that, let me just say that the learning of another language not only involves entering into another language, it means entering into another culture, and another way of feeling, another way of experiencing, another way of thinking, and so forth. Not totally different, of course, or we wouldn't be able to do it. But at least somewhat different, and that by itself is a broadening experience in our general education. So, what happened, of course, was that then Jerome ended up learning Hebrew and really became very expert in Hebrew, though he continued to consult Hebrew scholars along the way. And so he translated what Christians call the Old Testament twice, in effect. He translated large parts of it from Greek, and then he went back with his knowledge of Hebrew and translated large parts of it from Hebrew into Latin directly. Okay, he had the help with the Hebrew Bible, not only of Hebrew scholars, most of whom were rabbinical scholars, but he also had around him by now a group of people, many of whom were women, by the way. He was a clergyman, he was a priest. But he had around him Christian women who had decided to become nuns, but who were also very, very bright and well-educated people who worked with him on much of his scholarly work and translating work on the Bible. They haven't gotten as much credit, no big surprise, right, as Jerome has. But increasingly, scholars are now going back and recognizing the contributions, the vital contributions that some of these learned women made to this great project. Well, what came out of all of this was what is called the Vulgate Bible. The Vulgate Bible. And let me put that on our tablet, please. The Vulgate Bible, okay? The Biblia Sacra Vulgata, okay? The Vulgate version of the sacred or holy Bible. Now, the word from which we get our word Vulgate is related to the word that we have in English for vulgar, okay? Because both of those words go back to the Latin word vulgus, or it would have been pronounced in Roman times vulgus. But in any event, go back to the Latin word vulgus, which means what? Anybody know here? Any Latin scholars here? It means people, just like ordinary people. So the Biblia Vulgata is the Bible for ordinary people. Okay, now these would be ordinary people who spoke Latin, of course, and understood Latin. But that would have been the case in the Roman Empire. And so this Bible of the people became the standard for Christian Bibles for over 1,000 years. And then when the translations, the Protestant translations in the Protestant Reformation of the Bible began to appear, the Catholic version, which is here as the Douay Rheims version in our anthology, was based directly on that Vulgate. So that there is a very long tradition within the Catholic Church of the Vulgate being the foundational text for the Bible and the understanding of the Bible and the teaching of the Bible and the interpretation of the Bible and so forth. Okay, so the importance of Jerome's translation was immense. But guess what happens within a century or two after Jerome produces his great Latin Vulgate Bible? Everything historically begins to change, because that is the time of the so-called barbarian invasions. So that by 476, just a few decades after he has produced his version of the Bible, by 476, we have the first non-Roman emperor of Rome in the West. And that's something which increases and increases and increases. And Rome didn't just fall all at once, by the way. It was something that took place over a long period of time. But eventually, that Latin Roman culture was largely destroyed and transformed. Eventually, even the people who had spoken Latin in antiquity knew less and less how to speak Latin or how to understand Latin, as their languages were changing into what we now know as the Romance languages. Which are what? What are the Romance languages? They're languages based on Latin. And what are the Romance languages? Okay, say that again. French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. Right, right. And those are the languages that evolved, the modern languages that evolved out of Latin. And that's a very uneven process, as you can well imagine. You know, languages don't just change overnight. Languages go through long evolutionary processes. And those processes are not always even. They can be very uneven. And there can be changes in one part of, say, France that don't take place in another part of France. Or if they do, may take place centuries after the first set took place in another place. In English, we see the same kind of thing. If you were to travel around in England and Scotland, you would hear lots of different dialects of English. I mean, there's not a single dialect of English. There are lots of dialects of English. And the reason for some of those differentiations in dialect have to do with these different processes I've been talking about. So that in certain northern dialects, they still use words that go back to Old and Middle English that have dropped out of usage in the south and in the area, say, around London. Okay, well, the same kind of thing was happening all over Europe within a few centuries of the collapse of the old Roman Empire. So fewer and fewer people were able any longer really to understand the Latin. But the clergy was educated in Latin, at least to a certain extent. That doesn't mean that all of the clergy were Latin scholars by any means. Some of the clergy were only marginally literate. And there were educational reforms that went on constantly during the early Middle Ages to try to upgrade the educational level of the monks, the priests, and so forth. The most important of which took place under Charlemagne, with the so-called Carolingian Renaissance, in which the cathedral schools were set up in every one of the cathedral towns. A cathedral town is one that has a cathedral. A cathedral comes from the Greek word, ultimately, cathedra, which means the seat. And that's the seat of the local bishop. So in every cathedral town where there would be a bishop, there would also be a school, and that school was set up to assure the basic education of the clergy. And in the great monasteries, they would also have schools. So what happened by default originally and then by design was that the language of the Bible was no longer the language of the people. It was really no longer the Vulgate in a sense, right? It was no longer the Biblia Vulgata, which originally had been designed to be in the language that everybody would understand. But now, as fewer and fewer people came to know Latin, the Bible, not being translated into English or French or German or Italian and so forth, would become less and less and less accessible to ordinary people. First of all, not very many people were literate, but even among those who were literate, that didn't necessarily mean that they were literate in Latin. So, or they might know a phrase here and there. They might have a little smattering of Latin without really knowing it. You know, just as, living in our part of the world here in Houston, most of us who are not native Spanish speakers will know a little bit of Spanish, just by virtue of hearing Spanish spoken, and having contact with Spanish speakers, here in school and so forth. So we'll know a little bit of Spanish. That doesn't mean we're fluent, but we've picked up a little bit along the way. And of course, some people do become truly fluent, for whom that's not their native or first language. Okay, so you'd have all sorts of variations in the Middle Ages too. But increasingly note that the clergy would be the ones who would understand the Bible, more or less. And they would be the ones who would then communicate to the rest of the Christian world, the lay people, what the Bible said and what the Bible meant. Now notice that becomes a question of authority, doesn't it? Who has the authority, first of all, to determine what the Bible is, and secondly, who has the authority to determine what the Bible means, right? Who has the authority to determine what the Bible says? Well, notice somebody's got to authorize translations, don't they? I mean, the rabbis, when the Hebrew Bible was being turned into Greek with the version which is called the Septuagint in late antiquity, you know, somebody had to authorize that, right? I mean, there was a whole group of rabbinical scholars who actually worked on that Greek version of the Hebrew Bible. Well, who had the authority to decide, you know, what the text was going to be? Interesting question. With Jerome's Vulgate, his translation from Greek and Hebrew sources into Latin, who gave Jerome the authority? Where did his authority come from? To say, this is the Bible. This is the Bible. And then you've got the second question, which is, what does the Bible mean? Who has the authority to decide? What if there's a dispute? How is that dispute going to be resolved? Is there anybody who has the authority to resolve such a dispute in interpretation? Okay. Well, obviously, these problems are going to come to a head with the Protestant Reformation. It happens that during the Middle Ages, especially in the later Middle Ages, there were vernacular translations of the Bible, parts of the Bible, here and there. There were parts of the Bible translated into Middle English by one of Chaucer's contemporaries, a guy named John Wycliffe, and some of his associates. And by the way, he was denounced officially for having produced that. There were other gospel stories and so forth that were either paraphrased or translated directly into Middle English or into French or into Italian and so on and so on. But it wasn't really until the great enterprises of the 16th century with the Protestant Reformation that you had large-scale translations and translation projects to make the Bible available to everybody, to everybody. And of course, this was promoted in large part by the development of the printing press, which made possible not only the printing of large numbers of Bible copies, but also the distribution of those copies throughout Europe, especially throughout Northern Europe. And for those who wanted to stop the process, it was virtually impossible, and in many cases it was impossible to stop the process. I mean, once something has started like that, where you've got tens of thousands of copies of a book being produced and being passed from one person to another, to another, to another, to another, you know, even if you wanted to stop the process, how would you go about doing it? Try to collect all the Bibles? There were occasions when that was done, you know, where the local authorities would try to collect all the Bibles in that area, and then they'd have this mass burning of the Bibles in just a huge conflagration. Yeah.
What were some of the reasons that they were so defensive about people owning Bibles?
Well, because there's a question of authority. If, as Luther said, and again, I don't want to get into any kind of sectarian religious disputes, but this is cultural history here. And it's very important cultural history for what we're about to move into with John Milton and Paradise Lost, which of course is Milton's take on, you know, one of the greatest biblical narratives of all. So in producing one of the great poems in English, one of our very greatest poems in the English language. So in any event, one of the issues, of course, is authority, isn't it? Luther said over and over and over again that what he wanted was every man to be his own priest. Now, of course, if he were going to be politically correct nowadays, he would say every man and every woman to be her own priest. But, and he really wasn't trying to exclude women from this, but he was also a man of his times and tended to emphasize the masculine pronouns here. So anyway, that was basically the point. And so Luther argued, first of all, that on three premises: sola fide, sola gratia, sola scriptura. These were the ways to salvation. Sola fide, through faith alone, through embracing the true faith alone. Well, there you get into a question of authority too, don't you? What is the true faith? And what happens if there is a dispute? Who has the authority to resolve the dispute? Or should anybody have the authority to resolve a dispute? Very interesting question. Secondly, sola gratia. Only through grace, only through the grace of God are people saved. Not through the intermediary functions of a church. And then thirdly, sola scriptura. Only through Scripture can one understand the faith, the true faith. But each person, according to Luther, really had to decide that for him or herself by sitting down and reading the Bible and letting the inspiration of the Bible flow into him or her. Okay? Now, the Catholic authorities at the time were very distressed by this, because clearly this was a challenge to the traditional authority of the church as both the repository of the sacred text and the interpreter of what the sacred text means. Okay? So there comes into existence a crisis of authority, which is always a crisis of power. Who has the power to decide on what basis, under what conditions, and with what results? So, as you well know, I'm sure, from your studies of history, and I don't have to go into any lengthy description about this, this led to, absolutely horrible conflicts. In some cases, a Protestant group attacking a Catholic group, or another Protestant group, or the Catholic group attacking the Protestant groups, denouncing one another as heretics. In some cases, such as in Portugal, having the auto da fe, and in which people could be horribly tortured and even executed in horrible ways. But it wasn't a one-way deal. There were people who committed these kinds of acts on others, whether they were Protestant or Catholic. And ultimately, this even led to the so-called 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War was one of the most destructive events certainly in European history, and also in human history. And it was supposedly, it wasn't totally fought over religion, but it was supposedly fought over religion. And, it absolutely decimated the population of Europe. In which literally millions of people were slaughtered. And it was only finally resolved with the formula that Cardinal Richelieu came up with. Cuius regio, huius religio. That is to say, whoever occupies and has power over a territory has the power to decide what religion will be practiced. Well, smart people from that point on, not everybody was smart, of course, but smart people from that point on took the view that, religious tolerance, at least to a large extent, would be the most effective way to go. And eventually, that's what led to the foundation in our American Constitution of what we talk about as the separation of church from state. Do we want to live in a country in which the power of the state is used to impose on everybody the authority of a particular religion? That's the context in which the Constitutional Convention was operating, coming out of centuries of conflict, often very brutal conflict, and horrible warfare, in which that was precisely what was at stake, where there were people who were trying to use state power or government power to impose their religion on everybody else. So, in the 17th century, of course, that led to, the Civil War, which led to, by an act of Parliament, the reigning monarch, Charles I, having his head cut off. And then in 1660, when the Commonwealth government fell apart after the death of Cromwell, and they weren't able to hold things together, a majority of people from both the political left and the political right got together and said, this is crazy, let's restore the monarchy, but under new terms. And so Charles I's elder son, Charles, was brought back to London in August of 1660, and he was restored to the monarchy as Charles II. So, and a whole period began to develop in which people thought we must find a more reasonable, even rational way to deal with our differences. And that's something that we're going to be talking about in a future segment. The whole beginnings of the so-called Enlightenment, or what in England came to be called the Age of Reason. But in the meantime, to return to the question of biblical translation, you'll notice that there are certain words, without knowing the original here, for which there are differences in the different versions or translations. As our footnotes point out, 2 of the 4 versions they present us with here use the term love, and the other 2 use the term charity. Well, I took the time to go and look at the Latin Vulgate Bible before class today, and the Latin word which is used is caritas, which is the word that comes into English eventually as charity. The Greek word for which the Latin word caritas is used is agape, and the word agape means more or less the same thing as the Latin word caritas means. And it means love, yes, but it means a special kind of love. It means a kind of unconditional love, a kind of unconditional love. And so that was the kind of love that theologically, at any rate, the theologians were saying God has for us human beings, and that we should cultivate among ourselves. There are other terms here. If you look at things like we know only God in the sense, dimly and darkly. We see God through a glass darkly, is the famous translation of that. That's actually in a mirror, But remember that mirrors used to be made out of metals, and they would get tarnished, they would get scratched, and that's the kind of metaphor that's being used there. And it doesn't mean looking through in our sense of looking through a pane of glass. It means through in the sense of by means of. So we only see God by means of a kind of scratched and tarnished mirror. Some interesting questions for interpretation. We'll talk more about this at the beginning of our next segment and then move on.